It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
Welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a show about all things University of Louisville. We talk about research, we talk about the great students at the University of Louisville, we talk about things going on campus, and so hopefully you'll learn a little bit about the University of Louisville here in the next half hour or so. We do have a little bit of athletic talk, which you don't normally have on this program. We do have a little talk about sports today, but it's not the kind of sports you normally hear on the station. We're talking about the academic progress rate. University of Louisville athletic teams have had their best APR scores ever in the last 2 years. That means U of L student athletes are succeeding in the classroom as well as on the field. The NCAA just released the APR scores, which is the way schools are graded based on how well their student athletes are moving toward getting a college degree. So a little bit later in the show, we'll be talking with Associate Athletic Director Christine Simatacolos about how U of L student athletes are doing in the classroom. But first, tropical rainforest. Best I can tell, there aren't any inside the Gene Snyder Freeway or in the rest of the continental United States for that matter. So U of L faculty and students have had to travel just a bit to do their research on ants and lightning in the rainforests of South and Central America. Steve Yanoviak is an associate professor in the endowed chair of conservation biology at U of L, and he's here to talk about his fascinating research. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've been traveling a little bit, haven't you?
I have been, yes. Most of our work is based in Panama, also in Peru a little bit. In the past, I've worked in Costa Rica. I've also done some work in Africa and Australia.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, a little bit about yourself. Are you from Louisville originally?
I'm not from Louisville originally. I'm a Pennsylvania native, but I've lived in lots of different places, Oklahoma, Indiana, Florida.
Been at U of L for how long?
5 years.
5 years, okay. And you teach biology, right?
I do teach biology, yes.
Okay. These freshman level classes or these grad students we're talking about
I
here?
teach mostly graduate and upper level undergraduate courses.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the research you're doing. You got a little publicity about the ones on the ants. So let's talk about your ants and rainforest research, which I found just kind of fascinating and interesting. So just talk about it a little bit, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Sure,
here.
yeah. Fundamentally, we're interested in understanding patterns of biodiversity in the rainforest canopy. So we're talking about the upper layer of the forest. This is where the leaves and the branches are 100 feet above the ground. So for about the past 2 decades, my students and I have been trying to understand how ants in particular basically vary from tree to tree as you go through the forest canopy. So we climb trees using standard rock and cave climbing gear, and we get up there and simply put some baits out and survey the ants that are present. Now it's a lot easier to talk about it than it is to actually do it.
Well, so you're climbing, 100-foot trees
yes.
to go on the top of the canopy in rainforest?
This is correct.
And
yes.
you're finding different kinds of ants, or what?
So far, we've collected approximately 140 species of ants in this rainforest that we work in Panama. And the goals of the project are simply to understand how the diversity changes with forest type or the influx of more vines or different changes that are happening in forests that we're able to document.
Why ants?
Ants are I get that question a lot,
I'm
actually.
sure you do.
So yeah, there are some really good practical reasons for studying ants. So the first is that they're common. If you're going to study something in a rainforest,
in my basement,
as we all know, I mean, walking across campus here, you can't go 20 feet and not see an ant. But
right.
In a rainforest, it's actually dialed up a bit higher. So you can't go more than a couple feet in a rainforest and not see an ant. They're on everything. So having something that's that abundant is important because you can find them day after day. The fact that they are colonial and form nests in tree crowns makes it possible for us to go back and sample the same tree year after year and see how things have changed. It's a much more dramatic effect or ecological pattern if you actually see ants disappearing, because they're pretty well established.
Mm-hmm.
Ant colonies, individual ant colonies in a rainforest can live for decades. So,
right.
And the third thing is that they're pretty well known. So if you're going to study something in a rainforest, there are certainly lots of different organisms we could be working on, but many of them are not known to science yet. And so it's better to study something that we actually can put names on.
Right.
It's easier for my grad students to be able to come home with a species list and say, these are the things we actually found. Here's how they're changing as a result of disturbance or you name it.
And you've been doing this for how many years now? You said 20?
A little over 20 years.
20 years,
Yeah.
okay. Okay. We're talking to Steve Yanoviak, who's a biology professor at the University of Louisville and the endowed chair of conservation biology. We're talking about rainforests and some of the research he's been doing in these rainforests over the past several years. So what are you finding out? I mean, you've surveyed these ants for 20 years in the tree canopies. What's the difference between now and from 1997?
So that answer is still waiting to be determined, actually. So we are continuing our annual surveys of many of these trees out there. In the meantime, and it takes a long time to see a response in an ant colony, but in the meantime, we've been exploring other types of questions, like what is the role of woody vines? We call them lianas. Things like grapevine or poison ivy would fall into that category of plants. What are the effects of those plants on ant diversity in the canopy? Because that's one plant group in the tropics that we know is increasing in abundance. And what we have found is that when you remove lianas, remove these plant elements from trees, we see a decline in ant diversity in those tree crowns. And so the larger patterns that we've been exploring and discovering most recently have to do with relationships between ants and certain classes of plants in the rainforest that we know happen to be changing.
You've also looked at swimming ants.
Yes, yeah. So
I've seen this article. I read this article and that you put out, this research. So tell us about the swimming ants and what you've learned about swimming ants.
Yeah, so in the process of doing all this biodiversity research, we've also learned a lot about the behavior of ants in the canopy. And one thing we've noticed is that ants, if they fall out of a tree, some of them will glide back to the tree trunk like Superman.
Glide.
Glide, yes, literally. They have
They have
no
like
wings.
webbed feet or wings?
They
or
just
what?
stick their legs out and they use basically controlled falling to get themselves back to the tree. But that's not about swimming.
So
but
ants, all right, right.
This is a precursor to swimming.
Right,
because
but I think one of your students has done some research on whether ants can stay above the surface of the water as well. But this sounds like we've got Superman flying, the super ant, I guess, flying from tree to tree.
This is true, yes. And basically what they're trying to do is avoid landing in the leaf litter in the understory. Because for an ant that lives in a tree crown where there's a lot of light, it's really a dangerous situation to fall into that dark, complex, predator-filled understory. And so they avoid it by
snakes and other things down there, yeah.
lizards and other ant species actually that will attack them. So they avoid that fate by going back to the tree trunk, avoiding landing in the understory. Now, not all ants can do that. And so some of them, when they land in the understory, the surface of the forest, if it happens to be flooded, they will actually swim away to safety. And so that's something that we discovered in the process of studying the gliding behavior in ants. We just started dropping them into water and say, what happens? Well, they got up and they swam across to the shore.
I think people, when they hear this, they're just going, well, I've seen ants in water before, but I didn't really notice whether they swam or not. What you're telling me is these ants have the capability to A, fly, and B, swim with some dexterity.
Yes, it's actually quite impressive. So they'll go more than 10 meters a second across the surface of the water, and that's
pretty quick.
It may be hard to visualize, but that's quick. For something the size of an ant, that's way more than 3 body lengths per second, and a human could not swim that fast. So it's really impressive when you see it.
I want to talk a little bit about lightning when we come back here in a second.
Sure.
One more question about the ants. What can we learn here in the United States about the ants, or is there any collusion or any link at all to what you're discovering in the rainforest?
Everything I've just talked to you about, we are doing here in Kentucky as well. So I have students, mostly undergraduates from UofL, who have been climbing trees here, dropping ants, looking at how they glide, looking at how they swim, also looking at patterns of diversity. For example, do we see specific ant species always associated with oak trees, always associated with maple trees, and so forth. In terms of broader applications, really it's just about understanding patterns of diversity and how those are being changed by human intervention.
So is climate change playing a role in anything that you've seen so far with the ant populations in these rainforests?
It's difficult for me to say specifically that there's a link to climate change, but we have been doing quite a bit of work with the thermal biology of ants lately. So the thermal biology is basically understanding what happens to an ant when it gets too hot, essentially, on a tree branch, because ants are experiencing quite high temperatures as they wander around on tree branches. It's been actually pretty remarkable. We find that the ants are operating at what we call their thermal limit. So they're really baking up there in the sun. So anything that changes the temperature, the ambient temperature they're experiencing during the day is likely to affect their behavior over the long term.
Or they adapt to it. Right?
Potentially, but it's happening too fast for them to evolve
Quick enough.
basically quick enough to deal with it. Yes.
We're talking to UofL biology professor Steve Yanoviak, I said that right, who's the conservation biologist in the endowed chair at UofL. And he's here to talk about his research of tree canopies and what's going on in the rainforest in South America and Central America. Steve, you're also looking, you and your students, I guess, are also looking at lightning and how that impacts rainforests. What have you found?
So we're basically monitoring lightning strikes as they happen in real time in a forest in Panama. We're providing the first real-time data on the distribution of lightning strikes in the forest, and that's really exciting for us. I've always been fascinated by lightning. What is it doing to trees in the rainforest? Does it kill trees? Do the trees survive lightning strikes? Do we see the kind of damage we see here with pine trees and oaks and maples? And the brief answer to your question is that we're finding that everything we thought was happening is actually not happening the same way in the rainforest.
Meaning what? What did you think was happening in a rainforest when lightning strikes?
To be honest, I wasn't quite sure. I'd seen a tree get struck by lightning in 1996 when I was a grad student in Panama, and I noticed that there was no evidence that it had happened. And that struck me as very odd.
So
and
the tree wasn't split, branches weren't flying all over the place, there was
absolutely
no burn marks on it, nothing.
No, there was no evidence whatsoever that it happened. 10 years later, I went back to the same spot. The tree was still alive. So
the lightning had absolutely no impact on that tree.
As far as I could tell, it had no effect on the tree.
So,
yeah.
so what was your premise then going into this
So we went
research
into
you're
this
working on
project
now?
thinking, well, maybe these trees have some way to resist lightning damage. The question then evolved into understanding the role of vines as a protective mechanism for trees. So we started looking at how conductive, electrically conductive, the stems of vines are relative to tree stems. And indeed, vine stems, even here in a temperate forest, grapevine is very highly conductive relative to trees. And so they may be serving as essentially lightning protection for trees in a natural
It's
kind
like a
of way.
lightning rod.
Yes, essentially, yes.
So vines, so if you walk down the Jefferson Memorial Forest,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a whole bunch of lightning strikes down there in southern Jefferson County, and they hit these trees, but several of them are wrapped in vines, those are less likely to be
They're less
injured.
likely to be mortally wounded, we think. Yes, yeah.
Really?
The problem, and I say we think, the problem with this, like a lot of large-scale science, is it's all evidence-based, and so we need to get a lot of data before we can actually come to that conclusion, and that's where we're at right now.
And that's
is
what you're working
generating
on?
those data, yeah. And just like the ant work, we're hoping to set up similar camera networks here in Kentucky to monitor, exactly like you said, Jefferson Forest, and see what's going on down there with lightning.
Are you trying to predict in any way where lightning will strike?
Only in a broad sense, and by that I mean that we would like to know, and once we accumulate sufficient data, we should be able to say that certain species of trees, certain sizes of trees, or trees in certain locations, for example, hilltops versus valleys, are more likely to be struck than others. And as obvious as the answers may seem to those questions, there are no data, no good hard data supporting.
So taller trees aren't necessarily going to get hit by
Not
lightning.
necessarily.
Taller buildings aren't necessarily going to get hit by lightning.
No, the lightning
More
scientists with whom I collaborate would say isolation is important. So being a tall tree in an open field, of course, anybody would infer that, yes, that tree is a target for lightning.
Right.
But a tall tree as a member of a forest canopy, where it's only maybe 20 feet or 30 feet taller than its neighbor, not so much. So it's been really fascinating for us. It takes a long time to accumulate a lot of data to answer these questions, but that's where we're at now.
Again, talking with Steve Yanoviak, who's a biology professor at the University of Louisville. Is climate change playing any role in lightning strikes?
So the underlying goal of this project is to understand how lightning is killing trees and contributing to the amount of carbon in the forest. Climate change does play a role in this because the predictions, the models that we have right now suggest that lightning will become a lot more frequent, and especially in the tropics, but also in the temperate zone.
Okay,
So,
even in Kentucky as it gets warmer.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Your students are playing a role in all this. Explain how you use your students to help with this research.
I've been very fortunate to have attracted some amazing both undergraduates and graduate students to my lab here at UofL. And they are, at this point in my career, they are the boots on the ground people. They're the ones who are getting the primary data for a lot of these projects. And I'm actually flying down Friday to Panama to go help them. But basically, they really make this possible for us. And fortunately, we've had some good grant funding to keep them supported, and I've also been very fortunate to attract students who are fellowship level students, and so they've been supported by university support as well.
Right, you got some National Science Foundation grants, don't you? 400 grand or 500 grand, something like that, right?
Yeah, we have a couple going right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so
and that's funding the research on both the ants and the lightning?
yes, two separate projects. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, very good. And so from your perspective, what do U of L students who work with you and the other biology professors on projects like this, what do they get out of it?
Well, for the students, I think it's an outstanding international educational experience. I mean, they get exposure to the rainforest for one thing, which is by itself is just amazing. It really does leave you sort of speechless when you get down there for the first time. But they're also interacting with Panamanian scientists. The field station we work at is visited by German scientists, British scientists, from all over the world. And
Right.
so they're getting a lot of exposure to other scientists and understanding what's going on currently in the world of science. The education they get down there simply by interacting with other scientists is perhaps far better than they would get on any campus, just because it's so much one-to-one interaction with the top people in the field.
Right. So
We're basically trying to build them up to go on to an academic career so they can have a job like I have, which is the best job in the world, as far as I'm concerned. I love what I do. I get up every day and can't wait to get here. So
well, we're glad you're here.
No, I am glad to be here. So
Interesting
thank you.
stuff. Ants and lightning. There you go. Steve Yanoviak from the University of Louisville, biology professor and the endowed chair of conservation biology. The NCAA has recently released its APR scores a couple of weeks ago, and U of L sports teams did very well. And here to tell us what APR stands for and to talk a little bit about those scores is Christine Simatacolos. She's the associate athletic director for student life at U of L. Christine, good to see you.
Good to see you, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. You and I have crossed paths several times over the past few years. Well, let's talk about APR scores. What is APR? Explain that to Joe Schmo on the street. What's that mean?
APR is an academic progress rate that is each institution, each university in Division I gathers academic data for their student athletes who are on each team. And they publish a rate, academic progress rate, each year that is a measure of student athletes' academic eligibility and retention and graduation. So whether they were academically eligible to compete the next semester, meeting the NCAA benchmarks, also whether they came back to school or if they were ready to graduate, whether or not they graduated. And that's, they do it over a 4-year period, so it's a 4-year average. Okay. Kind of like a grade point average for each team, if you will.
All right. So, and these APR scores that the NCAA just put out were from, 2012 to 16, is that right?
Yes.
That's not right? Okay,
yes,
so that's over that 4-year
2012
period.
to 2016, right. So it takes us a little while to gather the information and then submit it to the NCAA, and they gather it from all 350 schools and then publish it once they've gone through and validated all the data.
And this has gotten to be a big deal for the NCAA and for schools like U of L, that they really are starting to pay attention. It's a benchmark. It holds them accountable to make sure that their student athletes are doing what they're supposed to do in the classroom, right?
Absolutely. That's why it was created, really, to provide a real-time snapshot of what was going on in the classroom with teams. The graduation rates, it's a little bit delayed in how those are published. A student enters the university, and then you don't find out until 7 years later whether or not that student athlete graduated and what the graduation rates were. So the NCAA wanted something that was more real time. So this provides us better real-time data as far as how our student athletes are doing in the classroom.
Well, let's talk about the good news then from the University of Louisville. Best I could tell, it looked like U of L overall probably had its best APR scores ever. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Okay.
When you look at kind of from the time we started collecting this data and submitting it to the NCAA to this past year, most of our teams have had their highest score ever.
And you had, did you have some teams that had perfect scores? And was that over the perfect APR scores over 4 years or just a single year?
Absolutely, over 4 years.
Okay.
We have about 6 teams that have perfect scores over a 4-year period, meaning everybody that came to us on scholarship, is doing well in the classroom. The majority of them are staying here and graduating. The NCAA does provide an adjustment if they leave, maybe transfer, but they transfer in really good academic standing and are likely to graduate at their next institution. So when we look at our teams, we're really doing a good job of the student athletes making progress towards their degree and ultimately graduating, which is the goal.
So I'm looking at who had the perfect scores here. Were there 6 teams? Is that right? Or 5 teams that had perfect scores? Do you know?
Yeah, 5 that had
let's
perfect
give 'em props.
scores over the 4 years. Yeah,
So who were they?
men's basketball, which has had actually a perfect score over the last 4 years. And again, this is a 4-year average in each of those years. So really, they've been doing well for a long time here. Men's golf, men's tennis, women's basketball, and women's golf all had perfect scores of 1,000 for their 4-year average.
And again, what that means is they're progressing towards graduation. Essentially, they're coming back to school. They're getting good grades. They're doing what they're supposed to do in the classroom.
Absolutely.
Okay. And there are 20. How many sports teams at UofL? 23. Is that right?
Well, we track 23 indoor and outdoor track are separate sports as far as championships and cross country. So when we count them all up in terms of how many are participating in championships, we have 23 separate sports teams that we track on, and many of them had their highest rate ever. Absolutely.
Very good. We're talking again to Christine Simatacolos. She's the Associate Athletic Director for Student Life in the Athletics Department at the University of Louisville. And we're talking about the APR scores, the Academic Progress Rate scores for UofL, and how well the University of Louisville athletic teams did in this latest release from the NCAA. Is there a difference in the teams and how they are scored in that the athletes, if you've got the men's golf team and you only got like 8 athletes, isn't it a whole lot easier to get either a really good APR score or a really bad because one player can throw it out of whack?
Absolutely. Certainly you see that on a small team, losing 1 point can have a significant impact, whereas on a football team, losing 1 point doesn't have a significant impact when you think about the number of athletes over a 4-year period that are included in the rate.
And you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier about the transfers, student athletes that transfer to another school, as long as they're in good standing at UofL and they leave to go someplace else or they come here from someplace else, that's okay. It doesn't hurt your score. But what about the athletes like the Brendan McKays, the Donovan Mitchells that leave early, don't have their degree in hand when they leave and go pro? Or a one and done, for instance, in the basketball. Right. How does that impact the APR score?
Those student athletes are also given an adjustment, or the rate is adjusted for those student athletes as long as they leave in good academic standing and would have been eligible had they remained. So it doesn't penalize a team for producing high-level athletes that are going pro in their sport as long as they have continued to make good academic progress while they've been at the university, which obviously leaves the door open for them to come back once they finish their professional career.
All right. Now, as you mentioned, the overwhelming majority of sports programs did really well, but there were a couple of programs that probably didn't do as well as you had wanted them to do. So what happens with those coaches and those programs and those student athletes? What does UofL do in hopes of improving the retention and improving the graduation rate for those student athletes?
Right. So the teams that maybe didn't hit 1,000, which obviously that's a pretty high standard.
That's pretty high standard. I'm talking about some that maybe didn't fare as well as the other schools. They're in the top, not in the top 50%.
Oh, right, across the country. Right. So those schools, what you do is you really dig down into your data, and that's the expectation the NCAA has, is that you really dig down into your data and see where are you losing points and what's the profile of that student athlete look like. Are you recruiting students who maybe aren't an academic fit for your institution, or are you recruiting students that maybe don't have the goal of graduation, or is there some other issue with a fit for your team maybe that you're not recruiting a student athlete that is a good fit with your your team and maybe should have gone somewhere else with a different culture in the sport. So the NCAA's expectation is that those teams that don't do well are really taking a hard look at their data and figuring out maybe how they need to adjust how they're recruiting or supporting their student athletes.
And then does UofL do that too? Do you go to those coaches of those particular sports and say, you know what you didn't do is, you're in the bottom quarter of schools. You got to do better. Here's what we're going to do. Is that one of the things that's at the top of the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, certainly none of our teams are anywhere close to receiving penalties from the NCAA.
Yeah, we should say that everybody's fine. I'm just saying.
Right. But yeah, we actually sit down with each team, each head coach each semester and go over their current data and what it's going to look like when it gets published by the NCAA every year. And we talk about where they missed points and what corrections could be made to maybe do something differently in the future. Once in a while we have a student athlete who comes to school and for whatever reason gets homesick or just doesn't feel like this is the place for them, and if they leave in the middle of the semester, that team automatically loses 2 points from if they end up withdrawing from the university. So sometimes those are some things we can't really help. We certainly want to make sure every student athlete is a great fit for our university and our teams, and our coaches do a lot of work on the recruiting end to make sure that happens.
Talking with Christine Simatacolos from the UofL Athletics Department, we're talking about the Apr Scores and the academic achievement by the UofL student athletes. Let's talk a little bit, and let's give some credit to Marvin Mitchell and all those folks that work with these student athletes. What does UofL do, and what do you think UofL has done over the past 10 years to really do a good job of focusing on academics and bring the focus back on academics?
Absolutely. I definitely a lot of credit to the academic counselors and Marvin Mitchell. I actually used to work for him a long time ago in that area. But we want to provide the best opportunity for the student athletes to do well here academically and graduate. So in terms of supporting them with tutoring, ensuring that they're allowed to make up missed class time and work if they're traveling on behalf of the university and representing them. Certainly making sure that their schedules conflict as little as possible with their travel schedule and obviously their practice schedule. And certainly making sure that they're not just passing their classes, but achieving at the highest level. So, going for that A. Or if they're struggling in class, trying to get that B or C to make sure that they've passed the class and can move on in their degree program.
And there's a lot of support that they get, like you said, to make up for class and stuff. I got to ask you the obvious question. Everybody out there who's not a big sports fan is probably asking, well, sure, they're all taking underwater basket weaving, and they're taking the piece of cake courses. They're taking how to be a gym teacher class. What would you say to folks that say, oh, these student athletes are just getting through, they're just staying eligible by taking these easy classes?
No, I don't think there's an easy class here at UofL, and certainly what somebody might consider to be an easy class for one person may not be an easy class for another person. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but certainly we, and you've interviewed some of our top student athletes, thinking about I think the majority of our men's swimmers who just graduated were all engineering majors.
Piece of cake major.
To balance, the grueling practice schedule and competition schedule on top of the engineering degree program here. I definitely give them a lot of credit for doing that. But we have student athletes in pretty much every major across the university, whether it's nursing, chemistry, like I said, engineering, business. But some of them do have an interest in sport and major in exercise science or sport administration, which are nationally ranked programs. So they cover all the majors at the university and certainly work hard in their sport and work hard in the classroom.
All right. Well, keep up the good work over there in athletics. This is the good news we like to share on the academic side, that it's not just about wins and losses. Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.